Bum bum ba da 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 dee. Hello. Well, I have some good news and some really good news before I start this off. The good news is I found a bottle with some iron brew left over open from Christmas, so I'm not technically breaking my one bottle a week rule. But there's not much iron brew in here. But it'll keep me going for a bit of this. This is probably going to be a long, long patrol, so I'm going to warn you this now. Also, I've actually have modified it, and I will probably fix the spelling mistakes in the slides before I do the live. Probably, he says. But I might fix them as I go through here, because honestly, this is the third time I'm recording this video because I want it to be done properly. I recorded it first on the 11th, then on the 12th, and today it's being recorded on the 13th at 3 o'clock. The live is at 6:30. That's good iron brew. So, the principles and factors of cruiser design. Now, this is rather an interesting one for anyone like me to get into, because there is a lot of them. Cruisers are a spectrum, but they're on the warship spectrum, which is even bigger. So it's kind of like when I talk about the learning difficulty spectrum, and you've got the dyslexia spectrum part of it. Dyslexia and cruiser are terms which have been around for so long, so many different roles, so many different things have got bumped into them, they are colossal. It's very easy to both define and disprove a cruiser, other than we actually built some. But for a long time, the cruising role wasn't done by ships called a cruiser. They were done by ships called a frigate. For that, they were done by ships which were usually frigate built. Then they were done by sometimes by galleons, sometimes by carracks, sometimes by other ships, occasionally cogs. Sometimes you'd have galleys, all sorts of different Chinese ships. I'm not going to mangle them by trying to pronounce their names today, but lots of different ships have done the cruising role because it is such a large role. And so if we say this is your spectrum of warship construction, because there are always factors which affect construction, it's your own needs and etc. And I'll be getting into this. So ships sit on a spectrum. Let's say the ultimate battleship is up this end, and the ultimate, well, no, I don't know, a rowing boat with a pistol on it is at this end, and the spectrum is all in between. The cruiser bulk sits somewhere in the region of about here. If this is the full spectrum, this is the role of cruiser. It sits in the middle and covers a huge amount. That is the joy of it. But that's also the problem when it comes to defining. Now, this could be a very long, long patrol. It could be a shorter, long patrol. I have a feeling because it's 30 odd slides, it's going to be a long, long patrol, but we'll see. So, the cruiser age. Well, I've been through this before. The Admiralty of the 1930s basically decided that the cruiser age was constructors' materialism, then naval materialism, then naval requirements, and then political requirements, which basically says we're now in the treaty era. Now, the fact that they're writing that in 1931, in legacy of the most recent London Naval Treaty, and while they're producing a document for politicians, I would suggest that the fact that they actually are, even under those circumstances, are so bold as to leave a question mark next to the 21 suggests who's really in charge. Because there are some factors when it comes to cruiser design that are immutable. That no amount of constructors, naval, materialism or requirements, and political requirements can get around. It's fun. Sorry, this shirt makes me laugh. I will do the full shirt so you can all see it. You can buy them online. Anyway, sorry. So if you see me giggling, you know why I'm giggling. It's the shirt. I've got the corgi one as well before anyone gets worried. This is what they were thinking. This is what the Navy was thinking. This is what everyone was thinking. Or was it? Because every Navy's thinking different things, and every government's thinking different things. And they're all trying to think, what do we need a cruiser for? Well, let's start off with Lord Hill Norton. I started off with this so many times that people who are regular watchers on my channel will probably be able to repeat this script off by heart. But there is a reason for starting off with it. Lord Hill Norton's Sea Power, 1982, page 111 to 112, definition of a cruiser states. The designation cruiser indicates her principal task, which has always been long-range patrolling, and from this requirement flows her chief attribute of endurance. A cruiser must also be large enough to keep the sea in any weather, fast enough to be the eyes of the fleet, to scout into shadow, to overhaul the enemy in the chase, and powerful enough to overwhelm the enemy with her guns, though not to slog it out in a line of battle against heavily armed ships. A maritime island nation like Britain, with vital worldwide interests, has always been particularly vulnerable to the guerre de course, economic warfare between you or I, the attack on her merchant shipping on which her life depends. Thus, the cruiser became commerce destroyers as well as commerce defenders, the weapon of both the weaker naval power and the stronger. In the Royal Navy, the cruiser has to fulfill both functions, performing her traditional task of protecting the country's merchant marine from interference, and at the same time denying the use of the sea to the shipping of the enemies. To predominantly land power, cruiser warfare was a useful secondary form of offensive. To maritime power, it was often, and of necessity, defensive. It's rather a lot to ask for a single ship. I mean, goodness gracious me, you're asking it to do a lot. You really are. Now, this particular presentation and this particular long patrol is going to be divided into, broadly speaking, 3 sections, although I'll probably divide it into 20-minute chunks on the system, so if you can only watch 20 minutes at a time, you'll be able to watch them. The first section is going to look at, how do I put this politely? The factors which affect design from a conception point of view. Then it's going to look at the factors which affect design from a more mercenary perspective. We'll see how you would think about it when we get there. And the final section will look through some designs and compare and contrast them. Now, I'm going to draw a few designs which you expect to come through, but I'm also going to draw in some modern ships. The first thing I want to go over is that a ship doesn't have to be called a cruiser to be used as a cruiser, to fulfill the cruiser role. So, this is the new emoji, by the way, if you haven't seen it. If you're a member of the channel, this is your new emoji. As everyone who watched my channel knows, that I'm very fortunate. I have wonderful patrons. I have people who do exceptionally kind super chats, and I also have members of the channel who basically what they get out from it is emojis and badges in the chat. I honestly, there is, I like to do writing as well, and there's a limit to sort of how much time I can put in a week towards everything, so I'm honest about what I can provide. I have to say, I love all your support. Seriously, it makes everything possible, and This year, that could be a lot. I've got plans. And if once I applied for some funding from other options, this could be a very, very good year, naval history wise. Anyway, the foundation. All ship designs eventually come down to what do you need it to do? What do you want it to do? What can you afford it to do? And what can you not afford it not to do? What do you need it to do? What do you want it to do? What can you afford it to do? What can you not afford it not to do? Most people, when they look at me and I give this, they go, well, hang on, surely points 1, 2, and 3 are all the same one. They're not. That's the first problem. Once you start conflating questions 1, 2, and 4 into the same point, you end up with a battle between, you set up it as a dichotomy of 2 questions. What can you afford? What can you not afford it not to do? And that overrules everything. First of all, you have to ask what you can need and what do you need it to do? What do you need? Why are you buying a ship in the first place? What do you want it to do? I.e., what would be the other jobs you'd quite like the ship to be capable of? What can you afford it to do? Pretty obvious. Do you have to change the budget? Do you have the budget? Are you deploying the budget in a different way? Are you deploying the budget by having multiple ships rather than a single ship? So are you going to have it all singing, all dancing one ship, or have multiple ships? And what can you not afford it not to do? What are the constraints on you that mean that whatever you have to do, you have to spend money on that? What do you need it to do? Well, this tends to come down to questions of geography. Yes, that's wonderful, wonderful branch of the humanities, which scares people because it acts as the natural bridge between the artistic world and the science and technology world. Apart from the fact that history tends to act as the bridge more often than not, because, well, history is the wonderful basis for most learning and most computer games. In the end. And quite a lot of literature. And quite a lot of common culture. It's amazing. We really are wrapped up in our history for a race which keeps pushing forward. Anyway, human geography. Do you have a nation dependent upon maritime trade? Do you have a nation dependent upon maritime trade? How large an exclusive economic zone do you have? How big an economy do you have? How big a population do you have? Where does your population live? What does your population expect from you? All these can factor into your ships. If your nation is dependent upon maritime trade, then maritime security missions and showing the flag and maintaining those trade routes is going to be very high up your list of priorities, or at least it should be if you're being logical. How large an exclusive economic zone do you have? If it is massive, then you're going to need to be present in it, because an exclusive economic zone is a line on a piece of paper. It doesn't matter to anyone if you can't enforce it. And whilst there are some people out there who really do believe you can enforce these things with satellites or planes going overhead, unless you're prepared to start dropping bombs on people, you can't do that. You can't enforce it that way. You need to actually have a ship go out and go, hello, what are you doing? And odds are that will be a smaller ship, but the odds are that if you don't have a bigger ship which can turn up to back it up, someone is just going to turn up with a bigger ship to try and boss your ship about. If you don't like this line of argument, please have a look at what's going on in the East China Sea and the South China Sea right now. But not only there, there's also stuff going on in the Indian Ocean, there's stuff going on in various parts of the coast of Africa. around the world, even in European waters, it sometimes descends into who has the bigger ship and who has the ship which they're most prepared to risk. How big an economy do you have? If you're, doesn't matter if you're a large economy which is, on one continent, i.e., United States. If you're significantly large enough economy that you are wedded into the global economy, whether it matters to you, whether it affects you or not. For example, the crisis in the Suez recently, where we had the Suez blocked, is going to affect your economy. We're currently experiencing a worldwide level of inflation and all sorts of issues going on economically, and part of that is due to COVID. That part of that is due to, you can argue, some monopolistic companies pushing up prices because they can, but also it's due to the breakdown in supply chains which have happened due to COVID, due to prioritization of other goods being moved, and due to the disruption in the Suez Canal and all sorts of other things during COVID. We had all these things happening. They have caused a whole supply chain issues. And when there are supply chain issues, so supply drops down and demand remains the same, then usually the price goes up, because that's the same as demand going up and supply staying the same. If you want to manage manage systems in an economy, you have to manage supply and demand to stop inflation. But this means there's a problem for you if there is a spat going on between two countries which you have nothing to do with, but it's near a shipping lane, and they decide to start getting antsy to each other. You need to be able to turn up with something to go, please, because who else is going to turn up for you? We can argue that in pre-1945, it was the Royal Navy which turned up for everyone. That was who would turn up. Yes, other nations might eventually turn up, but more often than not, the ship which got there pretty darn quickly and tried to sort things out was a Royal Navy cruiser. In the Cold War period, there was often a race between the superpowers to see which one could actually get a ship there at certain points. We'll get into Soviet naval diplomacy at another time. I have done some videos about it, though. But what you find more often than not, we've expected in the last few years, is that American ships turn up, which is fine, as long as America's prepared to pay the bill, and as long as you're prepared to rely on America paying that bill. But the trouble is, as was recently explained, democracies change. They focus differently. And ultimately, a country which is a large enough economy, let's say one of those economies which are in the top 25 in the world, do they really want to rely on someone else's timetable to fix a problem which could be crippling their economy? What do you want it to do? Do you want it to do anti-submarine warfare? Do you want to do it anti-surface warfare? Do you want it to be anti-aircraft? Now, quite a few people are going to sit here and go, well, there was never an anti-submarine cruiser. Believe it or not, they actually thought the County class might be able to do anti-submarine operations at one point. Someone was talking about fitting them with depth charges and sonar. Okay? Well, Aztec. They have considered it with cruisers, and anti-submarine warfare is definitely a factor in modern cruiser design. If we're looking at the Soviet Navy, most of their large surface combatants are anti-submarine, anti-surface warfare specialists. Anti-aircraft, well, that's quite common. Anti-surface. Littoral combat operations. That can have an effect on design. How many boats do you carry? How many helicopters do you carry? What kind of guns do you carry? Do you have some small rapid-firing guns? They might be good for anti-aircraft, but they're also good for littoral combat operations. And you might be dealing with smaller boats. Disaster relief. How much space do you have on your ship? How much are you designing in? What kind of facilities? What kind of crew strength do you have aboard? Do you have a crew that's going to be large enough that you can take a few off and have them go do other jobs. Diplomatic missions. What's the ship look like? Its presence. Intelligence gathering. Ooh. What kind of sensor fit are you fitting it on? Maritime security missions. Again, boats, helicopters, crew to do boardings. All these things have a factor. What can you afford it to do? This is the nasty thing. Because if you're building 3 heavy cruisers, you might call them Panzerschiff, and you might arm them with 11-inch guns in the most inefficient design you can possibly come up with for a twin turret ship that looks really like it was basically a modernized pre-Dreadnought battleship, but no one actually thought to think, hang on, we're not in the pre-Dreadnought period. The Dreadnought period has happened. Leaving that to one side, you have to think through what you can afford. The Royal Navy would not have built the Deutschland class. Why? Well, for starters, they had a treaty, which meant that, frankly, they weren't allowed to, with 11-inch guns. And secondly, if they build all 10,000-ton cruisers, then on the treaty limits, they wouldn't have enough ships to be able to do all the jobs they needed to do. But if you turned round to the German Navy and gone, well, what you should do is build a Narrafuser class, they would look at you and go, why? German Navy don't have numbers, so they're not going to get the money for numbers or the industry or infrastructure for numbers. So they have to try and make every unit as good as they possibly can, which is why a lot of their designs either come out as interesting or looking like a horse designed by a committee, in that they are so crammed with various things, they've become horribly inefficient, and it looks like no one's actually taken responsibility for building them. And I'm hoping there aren't going to be too many people who will find that annoying for me to say, but there probably are, so salute with some eyebrow. Now, what can you afford it not to do? Well, what is the threat level your ships face? Environmental as well as human. If you want a ship to operate in the South Atlantic or the High North Atlantic, your hull shape and to an extent your volume and structure will be defined by that as much as if not more than what you actually want to fit into it. Yeah. It's true. Just have a look at the pictures of the Chinese ships when they're going home after they've come to the High North Atlantic for an exercise with the Russians. Just look at the Italian Navy ships when they've gone down round the Horn of Africa. There was a recent voyage recently, and various other deployments. The Italian Navy produce very good ships, but they are focused on the Mediterranean and to an extent the Indian Ocean. They are in the Gulf. That is their area. They are very good ships, but they are designed with that in mind. The structuring you will put into a ship which is focused on operating in the South Atlantic or the High North Atlantic is going to be far heavier. There is going to be far more structuring and division and far more solid in terms of its framing and bracing for the hull. Because otherwise you could lose a hull plate in the middle of the Atlantic. And I'm not talking about in normal sailing operations. I'm not even talking about in a regular storm. I'm talking in wartime when you have to go full power at full speed and that you can make and into a storm, because that's what's military and that's what's necessity at that time. And you need to be built for that. And that's also something which affects how long you can have the ships around for. Type 23s. They've been in service for a good long time. But it's pretty much common knowledge that one of the major refits they've had to have in life was pretty much their hull plating almost entirely replaced and re-strengthened, because They were the light frigates. They were designed to not be in service for this long, and the Royal Navy traditionally didn't maintain ships in service for as long as the Type 23s have been in service and are going to be in service. So they've had to actually fix some of their hulls. And this has affected also which ships are doing which roles and what are being maintained for. Alternatively, if you're looking at operating in the Mediterranean or Baltic, and you are not factoring in a very strong air defense anti-missile configuration, you'd better be paying hefty premiums elsewhere to compensate. You'd better have a strong air force which is going to provide you with a blanket air cover. And pray they're still around on War Plus 4 to protect you. But these are the issues. So how does this all factor into the cruisers? And I will say now this design, this wonderful drawing, which I put together myself, I have sent away to the lovely Brie Jeffrey to, well, I was actually just asking for a opinion on it. Very kindly, Brie has said is playing around with it this weekend and is apparently turning into a far better quality design than I could ever produce. So please all say a lot of thank you to Brie. Anyway, I still don't know how to deal with all this kindness. I'm an academic. I'm not used to it. Anyway, how does this all factor into cruisers specifically? Because we've been generic about warship design so far. Well, cruiser role is, as I've already been over, a spectrum. But these are some of the titles in there: trade interdiction, trade protection, presence, diplomacy, reconnaissance, sea control, fighting other cruisers, fighting smaller ships, deterrent. It's fun. So it's all pretty much about the money. Okay? This is the first and most important thing, as we went over with Lord Hilnorton's response. Trade interdiction and trade protection. This is what you need to think about when you're thinking about cruisers. The Great Snake, the Anaconda Plan, the way to destroy an opponent's economy. The Confederacy never stood a chance. Why? Because, well, anything that could have actually given them a fighting chance, they hadn't invested in because they were such a load of short-sighted personalities. A cross-country railway would have been a good idea. Perhaps accidentally have some ironclads actually in service before war begins. Having bought them as merchant ships, I don't know. Call them Brunel-style merchant ships and make them of very thick iron to give them armor plating, and just don't have the guns sitting somewhere quiet in Charleston Harbour or something. All sorts of options they could have done, they didn't do. So, frankly, they were always going to get strangled. It's a similar problem for Napoleon, wherever he tries to strangle the British, because the British can strangle his coastal trade. He can rarely strangle their trade. And trade protection. Of course, I mentioned Panzer Chief earlier, and the British, of course, couldn't build, didn't they? If you look at it on paper, that's the most powerful cruiser in the world. However, these three cruisers, not even a Type A county class cruiser, a Type B, an economy county. £300,000 saving is really reeking of economy. And two not even town class cruisers, two Leanders, which are the first generation of modern 6-inch gun cruisers the RN had built. Ambush, bushwhack, you don't even sink one of them. You're forced into harbour. And that's their job, because they don't need to sink you. They need to damage you. They need to knock you out. You're a surface raider. You need to be damaged. Damaged to the point that the big, scary Renown and Ark Royal are coming to get you. So if you stay in harbour, you're going to get bombed by skewers. That's what's going to happen to you. If you go out and try and chance it by trying to manage to somehow get past the cruisers, which do still have torpedoes, well, then there's a lovely battle cruiser coming to say hello and go, hello. I hear you have 6 11-inch guns. That's good. I have 6 guns too, so this is fair. Mine are 15-inch, you say? Well, no. Power comes with age and wisdom. Now, shall we dance? This is the reality of trade protection. Cruisers are about dealing with armed merchant raiders. They are dealing with all the sort of varieties of things that come up, but there are often going to be large units which they can't deal with alone. They will either form a pack of them, or they will be used for other things. They will cause damage. They will slow them. They will delay them. They might even sacrifice themselves to cause that damage if necessary. But the problem for the opponent is that if they get damaged, they're a long way from home and there is someone else coming for them. And they won't be damaged. They'll be bigger. Again, for diplomacy and presence, image matters as much as reality. Now, I often declare a tribal class destroyer to be a cruiser build destroyer. I.e., it is built with the spacing and shaping of a cruiser in destroyer form. So it has the space for diplomacy. It has the space actually for upgrades. It's one of the reasons why the tribals were so effective through World War II. They got space for easy upgrade. It's also one of the issues with the town class versus the crown colonies. Yes, you're making economy towns, but they actually have less space and are less easy to upgrade in many ways than the actual town class, which is why the town class cruisers end up outliving them in service. HMS Belfast. Case in point. The counties. Beautiful status ships. Now, the interesting question is usually when we get into comparing the Didos and the Arafusers. Arafusers are smaller. They have 6 6-inch guns. On paper, you should be saying that the Arafuser versus the Dido should have the less impact. But whenever you look at diplomatic turns, the phrases, the discussions of them, whenever they went on these diplomatic visits, the Arafusers always did better than the Didos. Now, there is a reason for this. A tribal is a cruiser-built destroyer. A Dido is a destroyer-built cruiser. It is crammed full of weapons. It is a war build. There is nothing wrong or bad with that. But that means it is so crammed with weapons that, frankly, it doesn't have space to do the cruiser functions and look as elegant and impactful as a cruiser needs to be. This looks like something turning up with basically, we've got all the guns. How can I put it? If you were in a scenario where you are imagining a bodyguard team, this is the older former Royal Marine Sergeant Major, black t-shirt, some tattoos probably, black glasses, maybe a jacket, maybe a concealed weapon, where depending where he is in the world. But it doesn't matter how big, how massive he is. He's scary without needing to say it. This is the slightly younger, slightly smaller. Surprise package. The one who knows every unarmed combat course you can possibly imagine and goes on them. Loves to do martial arts, loves to do self-defense. But again, tends to do the understated thing. Will not be sort of openly packing. The Arefuser, middle of the road. The marred-looking one, the one who smiles, the one who maybe has a debonair haircut and looks like they may or may not take their job seriously, but they are fairly confident in their role and they're calm. The Dido is the one that turns up, who's got holstered gun visible on their hip, baton on the other hip, pair of cuffs, everything on show. They don't look like a bodyguard so much as a member of, I don't know, the police out to arrest half a dozen people. They are still just as scary, but these blend in, have understated power and elegance. This is all about visible power. And whilst that's useful for a warship for warfighting, for diplomacy and presence, you want the understated power. You want to be able to send the message of, we're here and we have the power, but you don't want to actually be pointing a gun at anyone's head. Reconnaissance, the eyes of the fleet. Sea control. If you don't know what's going around you, you can't control the sea. And if you don't know what's going on ahead of you, you don't know what your fleet's going into. Both of these are traditional cruiser roles. They're about endurance, they're about range, they're about presence. And in the interwar years, they're about fitting them with air power. Because aircraft start to take on some of the reconnaissance duties. And there is a very interesting divergence in that the Japanese Navy go specifically reconnaissance cruisers, which do have all sorts of flight deck facilities, as I've been over before in other videos. The British go with the big box approach. And the Americans go with the dangling off the stern most of the time approach. All three have good reasons for their approaches. The British mainly prefer to do reconnaissance from the carriers, with the cruisers carrying out the role when they need to, when they're on independent operations. Which is quite an important factor when you think about it, independent operations. Basically, it means when they're doing the maritime security mission, they have to have aircraft with them. They have to maintain them. They're going to be out on their own, so they need a hangar. Both the Americans and Japanese are, to an extent, thinking about fighting the big battle. And both tend to be quite obsessed with the whole Alpha Strike concept. But leaving that to one side, it makes sense in the Pacific for them to be so inclined. But that means they think less about the hangar, because if you're operating in the North Atlantic or the South Atlantic, a hangar is essential. It might also create a great big target, which has a potential fireball in it, but it's essential if you want to actually have your aircraft available to operate. If you're in the Pacific, depending on where you are, you can get around it. Fighting. Well, if you're engaging smaller ships, you're going to need a lot of fast-firing guns. If you're engaging other cruisers, you're going to need something with some armor-piercing capability, but often cruisers and ships which are doing cruising aren't built the same as battleships. So it becomes more of an interesting conversation as to what size main gun you need. And how you balance that with your fast-firing guns. Deterrence. It's not necessarily a foregone conclusion, if you get into a fight with a battleship, that a cruiser will lose. There is always the off chance. The odds are in a fight with a battleship or a battlecruiser that it will lose, especially if alone. However, The question for the battlecruiser and the battleship is how much damage they will receive while doing it. If the cruiser has torpedoes, that damage could be fatal. If the cruiser has big enough guns, then that battlecruiser could receive significant damage. And the trouble for them is if they're on their own, then they have a question to make, a question to ask. What's their best course of action? Do they want to lose out on their operations by having a fight, or do they want to carry on with their mission? Example in case, the Rawalpindi. The Rawalpindi is sunk by Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. But after fighting Rawalpindi, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, instead of going on and raiding the North Atlantic and causing Britain all sorts of trouble, go home because they've been damaged. Imagine if Rawalpindi had had torpedoes as well as guns. Yes, the Royal Navy would probably have still lost an armed merchant cruiser, which they would have been sorry to lose because they don't like to lose any ship. But if the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are limping home because they've got holes from torpedoes, they might not be sunk, but holes from torpedoes, then the surface ships which go out to try and hunt them down after they sink the Rawalpindi might catch them. And that could change the whole of World War II. As it was, there are all sorts of convoys which get through unmolested and unaffected because they have to go home. Rawalpindi does her job. She's got no chance of winning that fight, but she does her job. Do the Germans learn a lesson? Maybe, maybe not. You have to read the rest of the war to find out. So now we consider the factors. Let's consider some actual examples. We have the Town class, we have the Chester class, we have the Town class, we have the Brooklyn class, we have the City class, and the Constellation class. So you're already looking at me going, Alex, those two are frigates, they're not cruisers. And over this. The cruiser role has been done by ships not called a cruiser for a lot longer than it was done by ships which were called a cruiser. Cruiser role has been around since as long as there have been warships. As long as there has been peace that needs to be upheld, wars that need to be fought, there have been ships doing the cruiser role. The cruiser is a new thing. Cruising, as a role, is a very old thing. There aren't now ships being built which are called cruisers at the moment. We never know. The Royal Navy is building a Type 83. That's planned. And the US Navy might actually replace the Ticos with something that is a cruiser. We can always hope. But leaving that to one side, and of course there's what the Chinese are currently building, the 055, which is cruiser and everything but name. These ships are good ships to look at to consider actual cruisers and consider their actual roles. And please note, I'm going to be doing proper videos, or I have done proper videos about these classes. So I'm not doing the whole stats analysis thing. I've done that. I'm basically looking at them from a cruiser perspective. What do they tell us about what was the nation was thinking about in terms of cruiser roles at that time? It's an example to think about. So, but before we get into that, actually, I'm going to go through this picture and why I chose it. The UK Carrier Strike Group doesn't have a cruiser in it, does it? Or does it? Let's consider these ships. We have the Type 23s, which HMS Kent and HMS Richmond. Type 23s have often been used for presence missions. To be honest, the Type 22 was designed more around it, but the Type 23 has certainly had to step up into those shoes, and arguably have done it slightly better than Type 22 because Their greater space, because they were a because of their being a light frigate, meant that they actually had more space for entertainment. And if I consider the number of times I have walked on between the up the gangplank between the superstructures and being greeted on a Type 23 and shown around it, I could probably give the tour myself. Then we have Diamond and Defender, gorgeous Type 45s, far bigger than Type 42s, and we all know they were built with the idea that actually we're going to have to do some naval diplomacy in mind. Because when you consider the entertaining capable spaces on Type 45 versus Type 42, it's colossal. Then we have Tide Spring and Fort Victoria. They're not really cruisers, they're auxiliaries, but they are used for maritime security missions sometimes. And we have the American, the Sullivans, which is a Arleigh Burke, one of the most general purpose capable destroyers known to mankind, pretty much able to backstop pretty much every role on that in that task group to a lesser or greater extent. It certainly is capable, but it's not technically not a cruiser. And then we have the HMLS Everston, which is again not a cruiser, but certainly a very capable frigate. And if we were going by tonnage and all those things compared to the naval treaties of the interwar years, you'd probably be saying, yes, they're pretty cruisery. So let's consider the Sound class cruiser. They are a group of 21 light cruisers built for the Royal Navy. Ranging with 6-inch guns and 4-inch guns, honestly, the light cruiser is built to fulfill 3 functions for the Royal Navy. Scout role, hence they can do 25 knots. The presence role, hence if you look at that design, it doesn't look busy, does it? It's got clean lines. It's meant to have an impact. Everything has a purpose. Everything has a sway. And then, finally, it's built in numbers. No, it is not the most powerful cruiser in the world. Yes, it does rely on its 18-inch, I think, on the first batch torpedoes. I think the second batch and the forward got 21-inch for that. But it has firepower. It has speed. The Chester class. Scout cruisers, technically built for speed, but capable of 24 knots. But they are 3 years older than the Town class, so one can understand that. 4-stackers again. The Americans do like a 4-stack design. This is the Royal Navy. It's a good design to go with 4 stacks. Gorgeous ships. I always have quite a bit of a soft spot for the Chester class. They are built to be the first thing you see. Okay? They are these high, white-sided ships. Modern day perception of them tend to go up and down, depending on who you're talking to. But for image and impact, these have status written all over them. And if we look, this one, and this one, this is a Navy forging its place in the world. It's going to build 3 of these ships. They're supposed to go around the Caribbean, mostly, and show the flag, and also be in front of the fleet to make sure the fleet doesn't run into things it's not supposed to. This is a slightly more complicated duty. It's supposed to all do all that, but also Britain has a lot more maritime trade to protect. Which is why this one's sort of cut down in comparison. Its lines are different. Both are great ships. Personally, if they're in a fight, I'd be in this one rather than Chester, as much as I love the Chester. But honestly, if I was doing diplomacy, I'd probably want the Chester because it has this great look. But the thing is, The Town class for the Royal Navy was one of many class ships they had. They needed something with more impact. They had lots of other ships to call on in 1910. For the US Navy, they're growing. They don't have as many ships. There's the Chester. Looks good, doesn't it? Now, we have the Town class. There are 3 reasons they look like this. 1, the Royal Navy wanted a big light cruiser. Something with a lot of 6-inch guns. They were hoping to cram 16 onto her. Which would have been interesting, because if 16 had been fitted onto the Belfast class, onto Belfast and Edinburgh, they'd have probably ended up building more. Or at least the quadruple turrets would have been used again on the Crown colonies. So they'd have ended up with 12 guns. Still, despite having only 3 turrets. But it would have made them interesting, because if Belfast and Edinburgh had come out with 16, they would have had 1 more gun than the Brooklyn class, and it would have been basically the US Navy going, but we built 5 triple turrets, so we'd have the machine gun 6-inch cruiser. And the British going, yeah, we got 4 quadruple turrets, we got 1 more gun with a machine gun 6-inch cruiser. There is part of which sits there and looking and goes, what were you children doing? But no, they are both building cruisers for for their own reasons. You have to honestly admit, the Brooklyn class, as much as I love them, they are built as light cruisers for a navy which is centering itself on its capital ships and which is focusing on fleet action. And it doesn't have the stations, it doesn't have the global presence that the Royal Navy has to do. So they can afford to focus their design on firepower. And if you look at that again, you've got the aircraft launched from the back. You've got all the assembly positions for them. Whereas Town class, they have a central hangar facility, they have all sorts of protection for the aircraft to make sure they can maintain their aircraft, because they're going to be operating more likely on their own a long way away from support. So this is why this has 4 turrets. The Brooklyns have 5. Why, Also, they were hoping to make this a quadruple 6-inch, let's be honest. I have no idea what the American reaction would have been, but I do mentally prepare myself for the idea of the US Navy going, right then, we're going for something with 5 quadruple turrets. 26-inch guns. The Super Brooklyn. The Absalon class. I love these. Absalon and her sister ship are named for 2 brothers, who, one of them, Absalon, was a bishop, but the other gentleman was just a sailor, who basically fought wars against some, I think they were warriors. They were a group of Slavs who were pagan, who lived in northern Germany, and basically there was a war between them and Denmark. This ship is not a cruiser in its title, but let's be honest, it's a flagship. A vast array of missions, capable of supporting other ships in those missions. It has huge spaces for diplomacy, for disaster relief. It has huge capabilities for a warship of its size and status. If we had been building this ship according to the metrics that were established in the 1920s, 1930s, this would be called a cruiser by Denmark without any fear. Instead, they call it a frigate. It does the cruising role. It does the cruiser role, which includes flagship duties, which is not part of the cruising role. And yet, it's a frigate. The City class. I've done a whole video on this class, the variants of the 3 type version of the Type 26, and what they look like and what their duties are. But they're going to be doing a lot of cruising. And you can already see, if you look at the design of, this is HMS Glasgow, you can see her impact the cruising role is going to have on her. You can see from her lines, but you can also see from the way things are spaced out. They're building in space, they're building in elegance. They're building in the things she needs to have an impact if she's being used for presence. Because you're probably going to see the Royal Navy returning to a more 1920s style model, with Type 31s, 32s, and potentially 33s. Potentially. Being the presence and mass ships around the world, the forward deployed ships. The Type 26s, the Type 45s, and later on the Type 83s are going to be the ships which turn up and go, hello, have you been mucking around our little friends? So they have to have that impact. They have to be the level above. If you're going to gradiate your presence and your deterrence and your tailorable impact on these things, you need to make sure there are visible visual clues. One ship has to scream presence, I'm here, see me. The other one has to scream I'm warship. And both of those screams have to be made in an understated way, so that instead of it looking like you're bullying anyone or you're being overly aggressive, that could give them a reason for causing trouble, that they get the message, but they aren't able to go, oh, they're bullying me. That is a very difficult design challenge. But that's still not the most difficult design challenge we have currently going on in the world. That's that. Constellation class. I love that the Americans are finally building a proper frigate. I also love the amount of people who keep debating how close they are to the original design. Well, the original design is a baseline idea. Before it to fit the American role, it was always going to have to be changed. If I took a frigate designed for, I don't know, what am I trying to say? If I took a frigate designed for Vietnam, designed and built by Vietnam, and I copied and pasted that design and I told Russia to build it, you would not get a ship which would suit the Russian needs or would work in the waters of Russia that Russia is going to. It's the same with any design. The reason why Australia and Canada can take the British design and work off it is because the British do expect their ships to be able to operate in the North and the South Atlantic, which is the same as what the Canadians are going to operating in the North, high North Atlantic. And with it being capable of operating in those, then it can take the Antarctic waters, which the Australians occasionally go into, and it can also deal with other issues which the Australians and occasionally run into. Because whilst Australia is famously Pacific and Indian Ocean, which are not regarded as the most dangerous of seas compared to the South Atlantic, they are seas which certainly are worthy of respect and are quite capable in their own right. They do also have the Arctic Ocean, and they do have some very vicious storms around Australia and some very vicious seasons. So having ships which can take that kind of pounding is sensible. It adds cost, but it's sensible. So when the Americans are building Constellation class, it's going to be modified for the American needs. Which means that hull is not the same as the original hull. It might look like it, but I can guarantee you the structuring and the framing are different. I can also guarantee to you that they have gone through it with a fine tooth comb, making sure everything works for what they needed to do. There will still be some mistakes, and you can guarantee batch 2 will be an evolution of batch 1. I'm fairly sure there'll be a batch 3 and a batch 4 as well. Maybe even a batch 5. Who knows? There have been all sorts of conversations recently about a future frigate, which And the Americans also have a future destroyer program, which is started up again for like the fifth time in the last decade and a half. The thing is, the Americans have a problem. The Arleigh Burke has been called on to do everything because the TCOs have been wound down. There haven't been any replacements come through from those when really a replacement program from them should be coming along. So the Arleigh Burkes have to fill both the high-end escort presence role. There have been all sorts of teething troubles since the Oliver Hazard Perry class left with the LCS getting them implemented. So they have to take on the continual forward presence role. And they also have to do all their other duties as well. And yes, you keep building more, and yes, they are good ships. But they are a good design for roughly 40 years ago. They are a good design, but they weren't designed with her for doing everything in mind. And let's be honest, an Arleigh Burke, when I've been on it, it's a good ship. But space-wise, diplomatic space-wise, you're actually limited in some respects. You see, let me explain. The Type 23, it's going to sound strange. You can go on that gangway onto the main, the gap between the superstructures, and this way you will find the officer's mess in that way, and this way you will find the hangar. You can be moved quite quickly through to those spaces, so you've automatically got those spaces. Now, before we get into this, go back. It's the Type 45 has, well, the Type 45 tends to be not slightly naughty in that they tend to have you go straight on to the hangar deck and go straight into the hangar as their way of sorting that one out. But they have options. Their design. I always think when I went to the Arleigh Burkes is that because when they were designed, there were other options available for doing those diplomatic missions, and the Burkes' role in diplomatic missions wasn't that. That wasn't really a priority when they were thinking about it. And they didn't have the happy accident like they had with the Type 23s due to simplicity of design, because they crowned with so many capabilities. So it is a bit of a limitation. And now this brings up this. Now, why have I brought in the Corvid class of the Glyn Stewart's Peacekeeper Assault? I love these ships. I love this book. I love this series. But the whole way through, when they're talking about them, they talk about how they're smaller than their predecessors. They're like the Didos, like the Arleigh Burkes. They are war-build ships. The Burkes built in the Cold War. The Didos built in the run-up to and during World War II. These are built towards the end of a 17-year-long war. They are powerful warships. They are battle cruisers, to be honest, not cruisers in tech term. They go destroyer and battle cruiser and then carrier. This universe. And for diplomatic missions, they put the embassy team in the flag bridge. And they have to shut down the flag bridge because that's the only space they have. They don't have other spaces. And sitting there going, well, that's a spaceship. There are limitations on space. Even in a spaceship, they would need you to build it slightly bigger. And then there's things like the captain's mess, etc. Doesn't have the space. This is your capital ship. This is your present ship. This is your diplomacy ship. You've been fighting a war for 17 years. When you build it, those things don't matter because you don't do them. The moment this book is set in the period when the war's over and it's peacekeeping, suddenly those issues are becoming an issue. Those factors start to matter. And that is the key thing. Those factors start to matter. One of the things often held against the Galaxy class when we talk about them in Star Trek is the amount of space they have for entertaining, the amount of space they have for appearing in non-essential things. You know, that's so held up as being Starfleet being either non-military or Starfleet being disconnected to the reality of being a warship, all these things. Actually, it's the most cruiser thing you could actually be. Have space for diplomacy. Have space for doing these missions. Have those sort of spaces. 10 forward, those sort of things. Those are the sort of spaces you would expect on a space cruiser. Because they need to take those things with them, because you might be turning up in a place which doesn't have an embassy. You might be turning up in a place which doesn't have the facilities for you to do that. And you need to be able to have people meetings, put them in a relaxed atmosphere, have the talks to them, and try and do things low. All the while, they're surrounded by your very powerful, very large warship. Diplomacy and the cruiser role is often about understated impact. And it's as important to cruiser design as the fighting capabilities, because if they're not propping up peace, they're waging war. And you prefer them to be propping up peace because it's a lot cheaper in the long run than waging wars. Summary. I always feel sorry for the Ticos. They are ships which weren't even built as cruisers, but became cruisers. And honestly, you have to wonder what person designed that front. Because if that's going to be your cruiser, your actual superstructure looks out of proportion with your hull. You need to have a slightly bigger hull. And yes, they do share a destroyer's hull and all sorts of issues for those warships, but the most recent and largest class of cruisers built by a Western nation but still I like them. I just think they could have been there for a little bit extra effort. They could have been so much better. Designing a cruiser is a complicated beast. It's a complicated one as well. You have a lot of things you have to juggle, and you have a lot of things you have to consider. There is also the most important reality of it. What fits one nation will not fit another. Those factors which we started off with are very different from nation to nation. They are very from region to region. So a cruiser, what is a ship which serves well in the cruising role for one nation, might well not fill the brief for another nation, because their balance needs might be different. If we go back to the interwar period again, it's easier to buy a capital ship or a destroyer from one nation to another than it is a cruiser. Let's be honest, capital ship, you want something that can fight a battle, and you want to be the biggest, meanest thing you've ever seen. That's pretty much universal for everyone. There might be differences in terms of range and endurance, and styling, but that's cosmetic reality, really. And the basic point, it's going to be heavily armored, and it's going to have a lot of big guns, and it's going to be as fast as you can make that combination. Destroyers in the interwar period, you want them to carry as many torpedoes as you can and have as many fast firing guns as you can. Be as fast and as mean as you can get them. Cruisers, it's a more complicated task. Cruisers have to do so much more, and they have to be so much more. A cruiser is a ship which brings the world to you and you to the world as a nation. It's always going to be so. But it means that when you're taking it in, designing it and building it and trying to put it together, you have to put in a lot of thought. into what you really want. So, my tip, and I'm using this one as the example because if I use any particular nation's ships, I'm going to get the fans of that nation coming out and going, but, we love these warship designs. Yes, you do love them. But the problem with this class, it's a great warship. And it manages to do the peacekeeping role. But that's thanks to the crew and thanks to the efforts of the personnel involved. As if you read the story, you'll find out. And I do recommend the Peacekeepers of Assault. As I've reviewed it before a few times, and I think I've told you all. The point is, if I was in charge of building the next class after this, they'd be bigger. Why? Because I need a capital ship. I don't want to have to deploy a carrier to have a presence. And I want my destroyers to be my warships, and I need to build them in numbers. So the battle cruiser is already a fairly big design. Making it slightly bigger and making sure it has more space for those necessary facilities, that is not a hard task. That is a very sensible task. A battle cruiser with added diplomatic firepower is what you're talking about. With space that you can have guests aboard, that you can find them accommodation easily, preferably in a space which means you have them secure from the rest of the ship in a way which doesn't scream it. They'll know you're doing it, you'll know you're doing it, but no one will have to say you're doing it. You don't have to post armed guards everywhere. It's just if anyone sees them off a certain deck. Are you lost? Space is a key part of cruiser design. Spacing is a key part of cruiser design. Understated elegance is a key part of cruiser design if we're looking for effective cruisers. The weapons, roles, and missions you choose, they're all a factor of warship design. But for a cruiser, for a ship which is about presence, about projecting the power, the capability, the role and purpose of a nation, design matters. As effective a warship as they might be, and as capable a warship as they might be, design matters just as much. So what have we got coming up in the cruiser series? Well, next week we have Pluton, the Marine Nationale. Also currently live is the patron vote. How far going looking at? Lives we got, well, that's why we got the patron vote up at the moment. But next month we have the Battle of Diu and Lord Charles of Bereford on his birthday. Fun times. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. And yeah, this is probably going to be about 75 minutes long. So I hope you've had a fun time. I hope you've got lots of questions, because I always like questions. And I hope you're going to join me for the rest of the cruiser series. There is going to be a lot of them. As you can see, this isn't included in those cruiser long patrols because it's a long patrol for a live. But yeah, there are a lot of cruiser videos coming up, and there's going to be a lot of discussion of cruisers on this channel. I'm possibly going to be the cruiser channel for next year. But it's good to know what's coming up, and it's good to have a structure like this because it allows me to plan and record some of them in advance, and it allows me to work it around writing more, and that is what I'm starting to kick off. I'm starting to kick off writing the next book. So I hope you're enjoying the first book. If you haven't already seen it, got it, or noticed all the advertisements for it, there's a link down below, and it's this gorgeous one on Tribals, Battles, and Darings. I love it. Some people keep messaging me with the various they've spotted mistakes in it, and I'm going, no. Sort of every time someone messages me, it's a case of, is it a new one? No, thank God. Is it one that's already been spotted? Oh, God. That means there's still only a couple mistakes in there, but they're going to be done. They'll be, if there's another edition, if enough you buy them, and if the publishers are happy with it, they will. And there's another edition or another print run, I will try and get those mistakes done. Thank you very much to everyone who's watching, and take care.